Good evening, everyone, and good morning to those who are joining us from the other side of the Atlantic. I'm really happy to welcome you all to this online event hosted by the Crimean Studies Center at Kiev Memorial Academy. For those joining us for the first time, our center is all about studying Crimea, its history, culture, and of course politics. Our goal is to create a space for dialogue that challenges old imperial narratives and puts the voices of the indigenous people of Crimea, especially Crimean Tatars, at the center. And today's event is a perfect example of this work. Um, all of us are here to listen to a talk titled "Speaking Through Land: Crimean Tatar Land Reclamation as Decolonial Practice." And for me, personally, both as a researcher and as someone who is originally from Crimea, this topic resonates a lot. As a historian who has spent a lot of time working on the history of Crimean Tatars' return, I can um, totally back up the main idea of this event. For Crimean Tatars coming back to Peninsula, the land was never just a piece of soil. Also, I basically grew up watching this mass return happening, and to some extent, my own views were shaped while seeing these um, so-called self-settlements and protest camps near the Crimean parliament, Верховна Rada Krymu. I'm glad to see the head of the Benjalis, Rifat Chubarov, with us today, and I think he would agree that these actions by Crimean Tatars, first of all, they were truly decolonial in nature, and secondly, they really defined the political landscape of the peninsula in the 90s. Um, to help us understand uh, this complex picture, we are incredibly honored to have a leading scholar in the field, Professor Greta Uehling, with us today. Dr. Uehling is a teaching professor at the University of Michigan and works with the Center for Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies. And I'm personally thrilled to have Professor Uehling as our speaker because her first book, Beyond Memory: The Crimean Tatars' Deportation and Return, had a had a huge impact on my own research back in the days, and it's still an essential reading for anyone in our field. Her work continues to be very important. Her book on Russian war in Ukraine won a prestigious award at Harvard, and her recent book, Decolonizing Ukraine, it deals with the topic we are discussing today. We are lucky to have her with us to talk about how history and let me say sovereignty are being shaped in Crimea. After the talk, we will have the Q&A section, so don't hesitate to prepare your questions to Professor Uehling. Please join me in welcoming our today's speaker, Professor Greta Uehling. Dear Greta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today. So I will just get started. Let's see here. Okay, so my new book, Decolonizing Ukraine, takes its readers into the lives of the Ukrainians, Russians, and Crimean Tatars who experienced the 2014 occupation of Crimea. And I focus in particular on the Crimean Tatars because they were disproportionately affected, and I believe they provide such a valuable aperture on Ukraine as a whole. So I think one of the book's central interventions is on the slide, right, into the decolonial literature on Ukraine, which is to argue that Ukraine is simultaneously disentangling itself from Russian domination and dismantling colonialist type practices towards Crimean Tatars that it inherited from Russia and the Soviet Union. And so what I'm suggesting in this book is that decolonization really requires two intertwined and simultaneous lines of sight. And it's also an argument in favor of the moral comfort of a singular victim narrative, and departs from any decolonial framework that could presume decolonization must only be directed like upwards towards the larger empire. I want to, just say a few words about the cover design, which is sort of a condensed visual heuristic of the book's arc as a whole. The artwork, as you'll recognize, draws on the vegetal and geometric motifs shared across Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian visual traditions. We can see the outline of the Crimean Peninsula delicately inscribed in that upper right-hand corner to sort of anchor it both spatially and politically. At the center, we have the pomegranate, very symbolic in Crimean Tatar culture of kinship, well-being. And I think most revealing is an element that tends to register last, which is the tamga in the center, the yellow tamga. And it was a hereditary clan sign that is, of course, now part of the Crimean Tatar flag. And I think that the cover really sort of stages a visual argument for the book's analytic claims that Crimea and Crimean Tatars are often present within narratives about modern Ukraine, but oftentimes like belatedly or obliquely, and trying to bring all of these elements together. I'm making this argument that when we look at contemporary Ukraine, we have to see the Crimean Tatar presence at the center of it. So the book is comprised of 5 paired chapters. The first 2 chapters, historical grounding, try to reposition Crimea from the periphery to the center by delving into the Crimean Tatar political imagination, rooted in a fully fledged state that extended geographically far beyond the boundaries of the peninsula. And also by providing that indigenous scaffolding and challenging any claims that indigenous status is too analytically vague or politically exclusionary to be useful for Ukraine. The unraveling section examines the 2014 Russian occupation of Crimea as basically a process of recolonization that worked not only through territorial seizure, but also by breaking down social relationships. Because this was a time when accusations of treason that had historically at least been directed solely at Crimean Tatars were suddenly extended to Ukrainians and Russians alike. And so phenomenologically speaking, the people, I talk about how the people who opposed Russian occupation felt like they were being forcibly, sent back in time. Then we come to the coalescing chapters, and that shows how the population displacement that resulted from Russian occupation of Crimea created conditions for mutual recognition, as especially in the public mourning of the Holodomor and the 1944 deportation allowed the traumas to facilitate the formation of a more closely shared political community, which was strengthened by a turn away from victimhood and the reclaiming of a very powerful political subjectivity. That brings me to the reclaiming sections, which follows the resistant political subjectivities that formed on really both sides of the new administrative boundary lines between the Ukrainian-controlled territory to the north and the Russian-controlled territory of Crimea. And I also explore how the residents in occupied Crimea navigated fear, enforced an unlawful conscription, And the book concludes with some critical reflections that basically argue that while this mutual recognition is necessary, decolonizing Ukraine also requires the very, very careful thinking through of indigenous sovereignty and the material dimensions. So, so I think that, all of this, all of the progress that Ukraine has made over the last decade with, recognizing the Crimean Tatars as indigenous people and the 2021 law on indigenous people, recognizing the 1944 deportation as genocide, sort of begs a question, like, why my bifocal approach, right? Why these simultaneous lines of sight? And I think that, I want to show how, despite significant developments over the last decade, there are still important considerations that remain. And so to do that, I want to revisit a phase of Ukrainian history that we don't often discuss, but that I think probably underscores the relevance of ongoing decolonial efforts. So I'm speaking about the Crimean Tatar repatriation. So in the late Soviet period, the Crimean Tatars are officially rehabilitated. First in 1967 with that very carefully worded decree, but by 1989, the Yunayev Commission comes along and calls for the abolition of all decrees that would limit Crimean Tatars' return. Decree 493 withdrew the charges of treason. And yet, when hundreds of thousands of Crimean Tatars return to Crimea, they continue to confront both formal and informal obstacles. And I think that, put simply, return was recognized as legitimate, but made difficult at best to accomplish in reality. And I think this gap between acknowledgement and action was, of course, far from coincidental. It reflects a deeper condition shaping these post-imperial societies. And so to name this condition, I draw upon Anne Laura Stoller's concept of colonial aphasia. Now, in the medical field, aphasia is a speech disorder that impairs speaking, understanding, and writing, but importantly, not intelligence. Colonial aphasia refers to an inability to acknowledge history. So in her view, it's characterized by the occlusion of knowledge about the past. This is different than forgetting, per se. It's more of like a dissociation from the inconvenient truths, like the fact that the Crimean Tatars previously had a majority on the peninsula. There's also vocabulary gaps, particularly with regard to finding the words that accurately describe Russian and Soviet violence and its ongoing impacts. And then finally, the compartmentalization of history, in which like the past practices are kept somehow separate, even though they continue to shape present day racial, social, political realities. So there's sort of a papering over of history and allowing for narratives that essentially avoid accountability. And so what I want to do is argue that colonial aphasia operated both discursively, but also found some of its deepest expressions in land regimes, bureaucratic delays, and embodied precarity in newly independent Ukraine. And so ultimately, I just want to today add to the conceptual vocabulary that could help us think about why repatriation took the forms that it did and why recognition without repair could reproduce forms of coloniality. All right, so my argument is based on my ethnographic fieldwork, which began in the 1990s. I went for the first time in 1995, and then I lived there between 1997 and 1998. My interviewing focused on the survivors of the 1944 deportation, activists in the Crimean Tatar national movement, officials in the Crimean government. I also worked in Central Asia, traveling to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan to work with Crimean Tatars as well as other peoples that had been formally deported from Crimea. And so I hope that this long-term embedded research enables me to trace how the Crimean Tatar repatriation was lived, how it was contested, and negotiated. So that was the basis for Beyond Memory. And then the other body of research is the 2015 to 2017 Fulbright research that I extended into working with Crimean Tatars who came to the United States in 2023. So during the Fulbright research, I carried out over 90 interviews pertaining to Crimea, and that was both semi-structured interviews with internally displaced people using a series of questions that was held constant over the 3-year period, and then also depth interviews. And let's see, 10 of those 90 were with people who continued to reside in Crimea while they were visiting Ukrainian government-controlled territory. So this is the research that is published in Decolonizing Ukraine. So in the remaining time, I want to take us using Beyond Memory from sites of memory to sites of settlement, because I feel that like land is kind of a very important conceptual hinge here. I'll talk about the material manifestations of colonial aphasia in both rural and urban land and property reclamations, then the bifocal approach that I briefly outlined, and the recovery, the evidence of this recovery from colonial aphasia in contemporary Ukraine will be where we end up. Okay, so in Beyond Memory, I argue that in the absence of archives, written history, or oral testimony, Crimean Tatars narratives generated a very compelling body of knowledge that produced what Raymond Williams would term like a structure of feeling for homeland, a very robust idea and affect of attachment to the historic homeland. And of course, social memories aren't necessarily transmitted intact, right? They require negotiation, correction, reinterpretation. And so social memory is necessary but not sufficient alone for the mass return, and activists and authorities in the Crimean Tatar national movement harness this attachment to energize the political effort to return Crimean Tatars to that historic homeland. So looking past the sites of memory to the sites of settlement, I want to tell you the story of Asan. So Asan was born in Uzbekistan. His family had been deported with the rest of the Crimean Tatar people in 1944, and his grandmother perished in the first few days of exile. His mother, a young girl at the time, survived and was able to bequeath her deep attachment to Crimea to Asan and his siblings. And Asan returned with a completely reasonable expectation. Having sold his property in Uzbekistan, he wanted to purchase a home, register his presence, and reestablish his life in Crimea. But of course, he was unable to either buy or rent property because the local authorities repeatedly denied him that right. And so he and a number of his friends and acquaintances did what many returnees were ultimately forced to do during this period. They erected a tent camp on formerly Soviet state property on the outskirts of Simferopol and began building themselves dwellings. one of which you can see to the left on the slide. But of course, soon police arrived to evict them, and they formed a semicircle, doused themselves with gasoline, and held matches in their hands, telling the police that if they didn't leave, they would all burn together. And of course, the police, not being that committed to this project of evicting the Crimean Tatars, retreated. So this practice of threatening self-immolation was integral to the process of return, and it made both a moral statement, but it also worked as part of a larger pragmatic strategy for resisting removal, and a very calculated intervention that, I think into this system, which I would say, was a world in which Crimean Tatars were, simultaneously very, very visible as ethnicized, unwanted, disposable people, and they were invisible as rights-bearing subjects. So there was this tension or this contradiction inherent in the return. So land reclamation was a response to this regime and a sort of a decolonial practice against the informal settlements that had become such a tool of exclusion and a means for withholding legality and withholding recognition. I put land reclamation on the slide. At the time, these practices were often described as illegal. The word samozakhvat was bandied about to denote the so-called capturing of land. Of course, Crimean Tatars quipped that it would be better called samozakhvat or self-return. I guess reclamation is a more neutral term that sort of captures the resilient quality of a response to what was colonial aphasia that they encountered. And this history was definitely compartmentalized, right? They were, on one hand, Crimean Tatars were continually reminded about their ostensible World War treason, but the orders and the decrees that had cleared their name were somehow conveniently left out of that discourse and pushed to the side. And so this is what I mean by colonial aphasia having material manifestations. Mustafa Gemayel explained the administrative dimensions of this lack of land for settlement, telling me that, quite directly, that when the Crimean Tatars began returning, the authorities were not thrilled. But they didn't want to allow them to return. But of course, glasnost and perestroika had occurred. Ukraine had become independent. And so they couldn't simply redeport them as they had done in the past. So they used bureaucratic measures to refuse the Tatars' requests. And, at the same time that land was being refused to Crimean Tatars, land was being distributed to Russian and Ukrainian population for various purposes. And so he talked about at he said it was at the local politics. Agitators even went around to families in the villages to say, hurry up and take land, invite your friends and relatives from Russia. We'll help you receive this land. You can build. Otherwise, Crimea will become Tatar. He also described what happened around the photon factory at the time, where they didn't approve people's vacations until they had written an application to receive a plot of land. So this was official politics, and so these peri-urban informal settlements were not an accident. They're not a coincidence. They're a direct result of state practice. Now, I don't want to ignore the whole constellation of contributing factors, so I just wanted to talk about that. a little bit, of course, the Soviet Union had a program for housing newly rehabilitated, retreating Crimean Tatars, but it was incomplete. It was plagued by bureaucratic problems. Something that I think is really important and significant is that around this time, Ukraine embarked upon a very ambitious program of land reform to privatize former state property. But this process unduly privileged former state employees of the state, the sovkhoz and kolkhoz collective farms. And Crimean Tatars were deemed ineligible because they had not been living in Crimea during the Soviet years, right? Quite obviously, because they had been forcibly deported. So this was a moment in which independent Ukraine effectually perpetuated unfair Soviet practices rather than eradicated. And here too, we have kind of a signature feature of aphasia, which is the occlusion of knowledge that before there were sovkhoz and kolkhoz, a great deal of the land in Crimea had been Crimean Tatar. And so sort of erasing knowledge of the Crimean Tatars' historic presence or occluding it and compartmentalizing these histories. Of course, economic difficulties have to be taken into account. Building supplies went up with rampant inflation at the same time that the hryvnia was being devalued. And so anybody that was trying to build a home was quite disadvantaged around this time. And of course, supply chains from Russia were broken. There was an enormous energy problem leading to rolling blackouts. You know what that means for yourselves. And so there was also discriminatory attitudes. I think that decades of rhetoric that all Crimean Tatars were traitors really eclipsed a fuller picture of the Soviet era deportation and predisposed some Crimean Tatar residents against the returnees. And then finally, the Propiska system kind of became an accomplice to all of these contributing factors, providing that bureaucratic means whereby, people could be deemed ineligible for legal employment because they didn't have housing, or ineligible for housing because they didn't have employment. And so the Crimean Tatars, of course, in addition to these land reclamations, launched a political response. There are some pictures on the left-hand side from of a hunger strike. Also, the picket that Martin referred to, one of the pickets that Martin referred to in the center of Simferopol. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian government initially at least refused to acknowledge the Majlis, right? There was this idea that it should be treated not in indigenous terms, but in like it could be somehow registered as like a non-governmental organization, even though it replicated a form of political organization that had existed in the past. And then, I mentioned that there was sort of a racialized idea of Crimean Tatars. And I think that the graffiti of the time encapsulates that sort of Orientalist way of seeing Crimean Tatars, death to blacks, death to Crimean Tatars, Crimea is white. During this time, really, not even the dead were safe from erasure. The pictures are shared with me. All of the pictures in this presentation are mine, except for where I note them. And this was given to me by a colleague. This depicts the ancient Muslim gravestone used in building material for a bathroom wall. That bathroom wall is right, the wall, it's right there. It's this stone right here. Uh, so to put this in kind of numerical terms, according to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in the late 1990s, of approximately 300 squatter settlements, 90% lacked paved roads, 70% lacked running water, and 25% were without electricity. The Committee on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination of the UN also voiced its concern in 2011 about the lack of restitution or some form of compensation for what was calculated to be some 80,000 private dwellings, 34,000 hectares of farmland, 86% of Crimean Tatars living in rural areas, and excluded from agricultural land restitution. Okay, so that brings us to sort of the political economy or the ecology of deliberate neglect. Ukraine has its own highly unique history. The work of what the work of others, though, show that there's sort of a systematicity to this, and the structural violence kind of had a wraparound effect. The lack of the power vacuum at these informal settlements contributed to political exploitation. Right? This was an era when protection rackets could capitalize on people's vulnerability. Because of the challenges associated with getting connected to the formal economy, the people who lived in these informal settlements that were distant from most employment markets mostly relied on the gray economy. And of course, there was a lack of services, not just roads, but schools, community centers, that are what Achille Mbembe would call a necropolitical strategy that sort of treats people as disposable. So when the state withholds infrastructure, safety, full recognition, it exposes some people to harm disproportionately. Life is allowed, but it's not supported. So, given the paucity of schools, employment markets, services in the rural and peri-urban areas, some Crimean Tatars sought to legalize their presence in the city of Simferopol. So this is sort of an urban example. On the slide, we see a dwelling that had been abandoned and then reclaimed by a person that I call Zira in Beyond Memory. And this reclamation has a sort of unique component to it, because as Zira and the family were preparing to visit the city mayor's office to request the registration of the property, they were literally confronted, and I witnessed this myself, by a Russian couple who claimed that the house had belonged to the Russian woman's parents. And of course, Zira responded by saying that, this is a historically Crimean Tatar neighborhood, and that Simferopol is, historically Crimean Tatar. And I think this exchange is really interesting because it dramatizes how the longue durée of the Soviet Union extended in many ways well into Ukrainian independence, And the undecolonized past was mobilized in the present, right? This knowledge that Crimean Tatars were once the majority of the population, had rights as Ukrainian citizens, were entitled to reparation was all occluded. So that meant that precarity was written into everyday lives, and the consequences were lived in the body. This is the interior of the reclamation that was on the previous slide. You can see that it involved clearing away accumulated layers of trash and other debris left behind. It really disrupts our notion of any romantic notions of um, of Crimea, and I think that you know land reclamation therefore sort of uncovers this gap between formal acknowledgement on one hand and action, and how inequalities came to be um, embodied and embedded in land and property. And then the third example, also urban, that I would bring to your attention is that sort of crystallizes what I'm trying to say here about structural violence is the starlit housing in Yalta. Of course, the Yalta region was historically at least had a very high concentration of Crimean Tatars, but of course, Crimean Tatars had notable um, blockages to settling there. They were given land in areas where there were landslides, distant from the city center, land that was unsuitable for agriculture, like from the Crimean Reserve, and um, so ultimately, the people who settled in this starlit housing, the woman that you see in the middle, resorted to putting cardboard because the walls were leaking water. It was very cold on the interior. Something that I'm sure that you probably find relatable as you weather winter in Ukraine today. But so Crimean Tatars at this time really, um, they had to build homes in areas that were distant from where their ancestors had lived, and they lived in constant uncertainty about whether they would be required to pay protection money, whether they would be bulldozed. But this process of reclaiming land did enable them to reassert their prior ongoing relationship to territory, assert their ongoing relationship, and expose the recalcitrance of the authorities of the time. So that brings me to 2014 and the 2014 Russian occupation of Crimea, which really led to a radical reevaluation on the part of central authorities of Crimea and Crimean Tatars. And I think this is, a moment in which Crimean Tatars go from an unwanted minority to being viewed as constitutive political subjects. And so, really, the question at the center of the book is kind of like, okay, so how did this historically disadvantaged group not only survive genocide and repeated dispossessions, but succeed in transforming how they were viewed by others, how they viewed themselves, and thereby gain a much more meaningful social inclusion and political power in Ukraine. Um, I think that this is um, the sort of like the story that I tell in the book. And a crucial component here is grieving historical losses. I think that Jamala was in her Eurovision victory was really a catalyst in this process because she won her song at a time when, many Ukrainians might not have been aware that Ukraine had an indigenous people. But her victory really telescoped the Crimean Tatar past into the Ukrainian present at a moment when it could become speakable alongside other Soviet era oppressions like the Holodomor. And so knowledge of the deportation was no longer occluded. I think it's significant that the lyrics were sung in both Crimean Tatar and English. And the lyrics really provided a way to fill some of those aphasic gaps that Ukraine had, oops, I didn't want to go that fast, suffered from. So I interviewed Jamala, and she underscored for me that she sang the song for the sake of emotion so that all Ukrainians could feel something of what her ancestors had. And emotions are central to this story that unfolds of how it was that the relationship between Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians could be expanded and reknit. Of course, it's important not to eclipse the remarkable successes within governance, right? The recognizing the 1944 deportation as genocide, Crimean Tatars as a rooted or indigenous people, and then the law that I mentioned earlier. Of course, the Zelensky administration has also overseen the process of the strategy for the cognitive deoccupation and established the Crimea platform. So, of course, the land issue is not just a land issue. It's also the product of a moral problem, this inability or previous inability to address the history of violence. So I put together this chart for Decolonizing Ukraine book. It's on page 45, and it tries to show in sort of one graphic image the effect of settler colonial policies. In the green, we see the Crimean Tatar population that was well over 95% prior to the Russian imperial annexation of Crimea in 1783. And so Crimean Tatars made up the overwhelming majority. Their language served as the lingua franca, and the Slavic presence in the peninsula was quite minimal. That changed as a result of Russian and then Soviet policies, and early Ukrainian policies didn't help. So, in addition to collectively grieving past losses, this growing recognition between Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians. There's another process that I think is really significant that I want to talk about, and this is sort of the another sort of ethnographic moment to delve into, which is um, um, the political subjectivity of sort of bracketing victimhood in favor of claiming full responsibility. So a man with the pseudonym Nariman said, "We just have to realize that we're responsible for everything ourselves. We have to act for ourselves. We have to think for ourselves." The image on the right is a visual encapsulation of that sentiment, taken by myself at the Crimean barricade in, I believe it was 2016. And really, so Nariman had this idea that um, responsibility was key to intervening in the kind of cyclic quality of dispossession. And they wanted to like reject any victimology that would in which they could be construed as pawns or wards of acting authorities, and really like thoroughly destabilizing the epistemic imperialism that could hold other people as somehow more intelligent, more capable, more powerful. And so I think it raises a really important question because it asks us to think very carefully about like, so what is the moral scaffolding of the decolonial project in Ukraine as a whole? Um, I'd like to think this through with Frantz Fanon, um, who was a psychologist and also a deep thinker on decolonization, and wrote a lot about the extent to which there can be a tendency among previously colonized people to accept like personal responsibility for things that are actually social and structural problems. And so I would close with the thought that, you know, as individuals, it works great to um, think in terms of like individual responsibility. What can I do? But responsibility is really only good to think with for as long as one does not take on um, responsibilities that have to be shared. And so it's really only a strong Ukrainian state, ideally with the support of international institutions that can truly and permanently dismantle the long-standing structural and epistemic conditions of inequality that would prevent the Crimean Tatars from being dispossessed ever again. And to my way of thinking, you may have other ways of thinking. You know, it could include everything from transitional and social justice mechanisms, truth commissions, reparations, restructuring democratic decision making. Um, okay, so ultimately, I think that this idea really helps us kind of decipher and uncover an additional layer, a material layer of why repatriation took the form it did and why recognition without repair could perpetuate forms of disadvantage and dispossession. Um, the picture on the left, also taken by me, is very close to the Ukrainian barricades, also taken in 2016. And this is was a banner that was facing the Russian-controlled area of Crimea. And we can see there the Crimean Peninsula emblazoned on the pupils, the Crimean Tatar Tamga emblazoned on the face, and the phrase Crimea is Ukraine and got to be free. So I am going to first of all, say thank you, and you're welcome to visit my website or contact me via email. I can be found at the University of Michigan website, but also I'm really curious to hear from you what it would look like to treat land not as a quantitative or technical problem, but an ethical one, and what you think about how scholars should be developing like the analytic vocabularies to recognize colonial aphasia when it crops up, not only in archives, but also, or like even policies, but also in the land itself. So those are kind of my questions. And I think that I will stop screen sharing there.
Uh, thank you, Greta. Thank you for the incredible, rich presentation. Um, Do we have any questions at the moment? You can ask them personally or in a chat or through the Q&A menu. Um, it seems like we have the first question in the Q&A section. I will read it. It says, thank you for the lecture, and I have a question about the concept of colonial aphasia, aphasia you mentioned. We see how Russian propaganda tries to erase history, but do you think we, in mainland Ukraine or in the West, still suffer from some form of the same aphasia regarding Crimea today? And if so, what is the best way to cure it?
Mm. Um, Thank you so much for the question. I think for the most part, no. Like there's been so much um, really just penetrating scholarship that I couldn't say, oh, Ukraine is, like Ukraine has this aphasia problem, right? So I would never say that. What I would say is that um, sometimes in some sources, the um, the Crimean Tatar deportation is taken at face value and not interrogated, right? Like somebody and that sort of recapitulates the Soviet narrative, right? Like they were accused of collaboration, end of story. But it's not the end of story, right? Because those claims are so incomplete, right? That's not the whole story. So I would say it's important always to interrogate that statement. And also, I think that um, it's important to expand like discussions of Ukraine have to expand beyond this binary of Russia and Ukraine to encompass a longer historical durée the that includes Crimean Tatar statehood in the past. Like I feel like just expanding that historical frame could be really helpful.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Uh, I
Yeah,
actually have a question.
great.
Thank you for your lecture, Greta. And honestly, I've been reading your book Beyond the Memory, and it was very helpful during my own master thesis. But the question I have for today, throughout your presentation, you were mentioning the term of deportation many times. Don't you think it's actually quite problematic term in the sense when we are talking in the context of decolonization? Since I would say deportation means quite how to say quite different process nowadays. We are deporting people because they committed something in some crime in another country, and they're being deported to country to which they belong actually. But in context of Crimean Tatars, I think it's very problematic. And talking about decolonization, we should actually avoid this term and say rather exile, banishment, or some other synonyms.
What do you think of the word surgun? Like, what do you think of using the Crimean Tatar word for that?
I think it's rather exile if I translate it into English. So, of course, using the indigenous term would be optimal, but to reach the wider, wider society, yes, you have to use some general terms. And to use deportation actually is to play with the same narrative that I believe the Soviet Union tried to put into the exile, because we all know this decree according to which this exile was happening. I don't remember the exact number of it. It's like 5519, I believe, or something like this, but it doesn't matter. is basically that it describing the whole process, that it was rather voluntary, and people actually had time to prepare, all their stuff to exchange it, instead of it like receive some coupons or I don't know, some documents that they can reclaim the same I don't know, let's say cattle or like territory in the place where they are going to be exiled. So
yeah, I take your point. And
mm-hmm.
I think that the word does resonate differently in 2026 than 1975 or even 1944. And of course, the language is important. And it's important to like interrogate all of those Soviet narratives about like what happened, why it happened, and not treat them not take them at face value. So thanks for your comment and your question.
Yeah, thanks for your books. They are very valuable, and one of the few about Crimean Tatars in English, actually. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Any other questions to be asked? Because if not, I may step in with my house privileges and ask.
I want to throw in a question, if I may.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I always lose the. Hi, Greta. Thank you so much for your steady, consistent, committed work on Crimean Tatars. I wanted to step outside a little bit of your focus today and address the question of repeated displacement, which had resulted in the formation of many Crimean Tatar communities elsewhere outside of Crimea. Over the course of your fieldwork and years of returning to Crimea, have you noted a sustained, or at least a kind of relationship which may have been shaping up in the 90s with the repatriation involving the agency of Ukrainian Tatars from outside of Ukraine? So that's what I wanted to ask you. And of course, we understand that displacement, in fact, had resulted in the formation of numerous communities elsewhere who have their agency, who have their resources, if you wish, and who also have cultivated very powerfully the call for return to the land. And the relationship with the land is so different for them versus for those who have returned. How is that, homeland Crimean Tatars in the 90s relationship built with the communities from outside? Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for the question. And of course, the communities all over the world have been helpful, both, in terms of moral support, but also financial support, political resources. And that has to do with Crimean Tatars in the United States, in Canada, in Romania, in Turkey, in Central Asia. And I think that it's important to keep those communities in focus. Like, I'm not a specialist on those communities. I think other people are probably stronger specialists and could, like enumerate with more precision, like their contribution. But of course, they're terribly significant and Crimean Tatar, right? So they have to be kept in view. Thank you.
Thank you too.
I believe we still have a little bit of time for one more question. Anyone?
Hello, I have, thank you very much, first of all, Greta, for the presentation. I really waited for that for all the week during we had the advertisement on Facebook about that. And thank you very much. It was really interesting to listen to that and think again, because to be honest, it is the first time that I hear that term, colonial aphasia. It is something that I think about, but I didn't have the word to explain this kind of like, even in the modern Ukraine, this type of like the perceiving of Crimean Tatars, even in 2000s, not speaking about the 1990s that you already enumerated, this vision and this image of the horrible Crimean Tatar coming to Crimea and who would take the lands, whatever. It is just like the history of the personal history of my family, of my dad, who was not taken into any job because of being a Crimean Tatar. And that's why like I really imagine that, but still I think that we have a huge shift after 2014, and we see that except for the situations when sometimes, as sometimes I say it's a joke for sure, and not a term, not a scientific term, but Ukrainians themselves are kind of emotional nation. And it is very easy for them to fall in love with someone, like it was in 2014, when everywhere it was said that Crimean Tatars are all our brothers or something. We usually have this kind of like relationships connected with family as a nation. And then when something happens, or any other nation, not only Crimean Tatars, it could be Polish people, for example, in 2022. But then if something happens, if there is some post-truth post-truth, not fact actually, but some, I don't know, information that was thrown into the society through social media or whatever, then people would come into suspense regarding other enough Crimean Tatars in the Ukrainian armed forces, for example, and why there are not so many Crimean Tatars, without taking into account the, I don't know, the percentage. Actually showed the Crimean Tatars among the Ukrainian political nation, and why there are some people who don't show themselves being the defenders of Ukraine right now. It is something, again, about this critical thinking that we still lack sometimes if we speak about the image that we make as a political nation. It is something that we need still to work on, because there can be a lot of words, but sometimes they lack acts in that. Still, after 12 years of occupation, and here again, something that it is not a question, it's rather my thoughts that came, is that what I mostly am scared about is these 12 years that become 12 plus years under Russian occupation, and about these colonial practices coming back during these years, even like especially for Crimean Tatars who still live in the Crimea, and how this changes the way how people think living there in that conditions for these 12 years, for the people who didn't leave the peninsula, because again, perhaps you know, for sure you know this Qurumda Yasha way of thinking. And that means that there are compromises, but what kind of compromises people go through, and to what kind of Crimean Tatars as nations we are coming, being in different, not only already cities after 2014, but even countries, as we said, right? Like there are so many, there are rather diasporas for a lot of years. There are people who still live in Crimea, and we all have so many different realities. And if we are, as a Ukrainian society, are going through trying to cure ourselves from this colonial aphasia, but the land Crimea itself is something that is coming back to very hard, like to the hard times of 1930s, 1940s, with a lot of political prisoners. And what can we do with that? It's again, perhaps it's not the question to answer, but something to think about. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think that, it's interesting that I think that the changes in government controlled Ukraine are significant. And I think that, one of the arguments that I make in the book, that it's actually more than uniting against a common aggressor, because of the linkages that have been built culturally in terms of like rethinking history, the civic engagement around shared values, as you know, artistic collaboration, and taken together, I think that in government occupied or government controlled Ukraine, it's a durable political and cultural alignment. But I share your concern about Crimea, and of course, all of this is really vulnerable and subject to inversions and reversals with the political tide. I am, like you, very interested when people, you mentioned like, well, are there enough Crimean Tatars in the armed forces, right? Like these numerical, I'm really intrigued by what elicits a numerical argument in this context, right? Because one of the things I argue in the book is that talking about Crimean Tatars in terms of numbers treats it as a numerical problem when it is a moral problem. The only reason that the numbers are low is because of what happened in the past, right? And so I think it's really important, and I say this all the time, that it's important not to get confused between the numerical issue and the historical issue, because the numerical issue is a product, right, of this history of, exile, dispossession. And yeah, thank you for the comment and the observation, and I share all of your concerns, and um, you know, I really, like everybody else, want the war to end and for Crimea to go back to Ukrainian jurisdiction as soon as possible.
I believe we once need to meet in a format of a roundtable or a panel to discuss how to avoid mistakes of 90s and how to bring up the agency. Um, uh, Thank you everyone for being with us today, and I would to say a huge thanks to Dr. Greta Uehling for sharing her work with us today. And um, thank you, what your analysis. I really believe it helps to see the history of Crimea not just as a timeline of events, but as a struggle for subjectivity and an event as a whole. Um, Please follow the Crimean Studies Center on social media, and the recording of today's event will be uploaded to different platforms in a short time. Thank you for your time. Stay safe and have a good evening or a good day for those who are on the other side of the Atlantic. Thank you.